This video is designed to give you a step-by-step approach to answering simple Mendelian Punnett squares. So there are 5 steps that I suggest you go through each time you're answering one of these problems. The first step is to identify the dominant and recessive traits. This is going to do a couple of important things. Number one, it's going to help you determine which letter to use, because the letter that you're using to put into the Punnett square is going to be the first letter of the dominant trait. So this step becomes extremely important in terms of just helping you identify which letter to use to begin the problems. The next thing is to identify the genotypes of the parents from the information that's given in the problem. In the beginning, there will be a box in which you'll write this information. The next thing is to do the actual Punnett square to find out the probability of the offspring. Remember, the genotypes of the parents are what actually goes into the Punnett square. Then you have to identify all the possible genotypes of the offspring. These will be all the unique genotypes that show up in your Punnett square. And then the last step is to identify the phenotypes of the offspring based on the genotypes that end up in your box there. So I'll show you one of the problems. I'll walk you through these steps. I promise you, if you follow these steps, it'll make these problems easy. So to begin, I've got our little 5 steps down there at the bottom. First, you just read the problem to get an idea of what it's asking. So you've got a heterozygous pea plant with axial flowers is crossed with a homozygous pea plant that has terminal flowers. What are the potential offspring? So our very first thing is to identify the dominant and recessive traits. So it's tricky in this problem because I don't just come right out and tell you. So the first thing that you know is that there's a pea plant that's heterozygous and it has axial flowers. Now, since we know these two things, you actually know which trait is dominant. Remember, heterozygous is going to be an example in which you have an individual with one dominant and one recessive trait. So, for example, for tallness, a heterozygous individual would have one dominant allele for tall in plants and then one recessive allele for short. Since it's a mixture of the two, the dominant one is the one that always takes over. So if you had a plant with one tall allele and then one short allele, it would always be tall. Get rid of that. Now, our important information that we get from this comes from the problem saying that the heterozygous pea plant has axial flowers. Since it's heterozygous, again, one dominant and one recessive, and we know it has axial flowers, that means axial must be dominant, because this plant now has one allele for axial and one allele for terminal. So dominant trait is axial. Recessive trait is the other one from the problem, terminal. So again, that's coming from up here. So that takes care of our first step, identify dominant and recessive traits. Next thing, identify the genotypes of the parents from the info given in the problem. So it tells us a heterozygous pea plant with axial flowers, that'd be this guy. This is our first parent. So heterozygous, different alleles, with a homozygous pea plant that has terminal flowers. Now, homozygous tells us important information. It tells us that the alleles are the same. And then since this one says terminal is on our recessive side, it's over here with our recessive traits, that means that this one would be little a, representing the terminal ones. So that takes care of our second step. Our third step is to do the Punnett square to find out the probability of the offspring. So now we take our parents and put the parents up into the Punnett square. Okay, so our first parent goes along the top, capital A, lowercase a, other parent going down the side, little a, little a. Combine them together in our Punnett square. Remember, you always write the capital letter first if it is a mix. Now our offspring genotype is going to be the unique things that showed up in our Punnett square. So there's 2 different unique outcomes. We've got this one and this one. So one of our possible genotypes is heterozygous, like the parent. The other one is homozygous recessive, like the parent. It's just kind of coincidental in this problem that it ended up being the same exact genotypes as the parents. This will not always be the case. The last step is to figure out the phenotype from our genotype. So you have to look at this individual and say, hey, what does that guy actually look like? Oh, I forgot to cross off our steps here. We are on the last step. So what does this one actually look like? Well, if this one's axial and this one's terminal, and we know that axial is dominant to terminal, one of our potential offspring phenotypes will be one that has axial flowers. This individual has two little a's, which are recessive, standing for terminal flowers. Squeezing it in there, just barely. So what that actually means, axial means the flowers will be kind of in the middle, terminal means the flowers will be up at the end of the plant. The only other thing we're going to add to this eventually is a ratio. For this particular case, this one would be a 2 to 2 ratio, which you could even distill down to a 1 to 1 ratio. And then same thing with this one, 2 to 2, because there are two individuals in the Punnett square that show each of those traits. So again, this one will go down to a 1 to 1, basically meaning you have a 50-50 chance of identifying those things. So if you follow our 5 steps, you can see we got our last one scratched off the list. This will give you an easy guide to go through these problems. The trick with Punnett squares is just to use the information that's given to you. If you're using the information from the problem, you should be absolutely fine with answering these questions. So you'll have a lot of them in class to practice. In the beginning, I give you exactly the same template that we're using for this problem here. Eventually I'll take some of that assistance away, but you should still be doing these steps whether I'm prompting you for them or not. So good luck. This should help you get through Punnett squares practice problems number 1. Once you get on to practice problems number 2, there are some more complicated things, and you should watch the non-Mendelian video and the dihybrid cross video in order to answer those problems. Good luck.